They say the mountains hold onto their secrets, buried deep where they can't be disturbed. I learned that the hard way up in a cabin nestled in the heart of the Great Smoky Mountains, not far from Kingman's Dome. Locals called it Last Haven, a pretty ironic name for such a desolate place. I never thought I'd end up there, let alone trapped, listening to the whispers of an old radio. It all started on a cold November night, the kind where the wind howls like a banshee. I'd retreated to the Smokies after losing everything: my career, my house, my family. 40 years old, and nothing to show for it but scars, some visible, some not, from my years in the military. Most days, I tinkered around in a rented garage, trying to fix broken machines, and maybe a little piece of myself too. That night, I stumbled across the radio. It was a beat-up old thing, dusty and scratched, with knobs that barely turned and wires that looked like they'd been chewed on by rats. I don't know why it caught my eye. Maybe it was the faint hum when I plugged it in, or the static that crackled in an oddly rhythmic way. Whatever it was, I couldn't leave it alone. As I turned the dials, the static faded, replaced by a voice. It wasn't normal. It was distorted, garbled, yet strangely clear, like it was meant for me. It said, "You've been chosen. The rules must be followed, or the night will claim you." I froze. Part of me wanted to yank the plug and throw the damn thing away, but my hand stayed on the knob. The voice went on reciting rules like it was reading them off a list. Rule 1: lock the doors and windows by 10 p.m. sharp. The shadows come first. Rule 2: if you hear footsteps on the porch, don't look outside. Ignore the knocks. Rule 3: keep the fireplace lit at all times. It's the only thing they fear. Rule 4: if the radio changes frequency, adjust it immediately. Letting it tune out is dangerous. Rule 5: never leave the cabin after sunset, no matter what you hear. Rule 6: if you see your reflection move, close your eyes and count to 10. Rule 7: before dawn, you must answer the final question. Failure is not an option. The static came back as suddenly as it had left, and I was left sitting there in the dim garage light, clutching the radio like a lifeline. The voice's words lingered in my mind, chilling me to the bone. I should have ignored it, should have left it there, but something made me take it with me. By the time I realized what I'd done, I was standing at the edge of the forest, staring up at the infamous Last Haven cabin. The first thing I noticed was the eerie stillness. Nestled deep in the Smokies, the cabin had an air of abandonment, like it had been sitting untouched for decades. The wooden shingles on the roof were warped and gray, and ivy crept up the sides like veins on a corpse. Despite the name, there was nothing comforting about it. I parked my old Chevy truck on the uneven dirt path. The sun was sinking behind the mountains, painting the sky in bruised hues of purple and red. In my hands was the radio, now silent, but still humming faintly, like it was alive and waiting. The front porch creaked under my boots as I walked to the door. A rusty key sat on the windowsill, its presence too convenient to ignore. I hesitated, wondering if it was all some elaborate prank, but as the wind picked up, whispering through the trees like a chorus of voices, I knew it was something else. The door groaned open, revealing the cabin's interior. It was just as I'd imagined: dark, dusty, and stifling, with the smell of damp wood. A single room stretched out before me, with a stone fireplace on one wall and a rickety table in the center. To the right, a narrow staircase led up to a loft, and in the corner was a bed that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I set the radio on the table. Its silence almost mocked me. The rules echoed in my head as I scanned the room, checking for anything that might be a threat. I locked the door behind me, double-checking the bolt, just like the voice had said. The first sign of trouble came at 9:55 p.m. I was stacking firewood by the hearth, getting ready to light the fireplace, when the radio crackled to life. 5 minutes, the distorted voice said. 5 minutes to lock yourself away. The air seemed to thicken as the words sank in. I scrambled to double-check the windows, securing the shutters with shaking hands. Outside, the forest had grown unnaturally dark, the trees casting long, skeletal shadows that stretched toward the cabin. At exactly 10:00 p.m., the voice returned. "The shadows are here." My heart hammered in my chest as I stared out the window. Nothing moved, but the silence was deafening. I turned back to the fireplace, fumbling with the matches to light the kindling. The fire roared to life just as a faint sound reached my ears. Footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate, and heavy. I froze. The rules flashed through my mind. If you hear footsteps on the porch, do not look outside. Ignore the knocks. My instincts screamed at me to run, to grab the radio and get out, but my body wouldn't move. Knock, knock, knock. The sound reverberated through the cabin, each knock louder than the last. My breath hitched as I backed away from the door, gripping the poker from the fireplace like a weapon. The footsteps circled the cabin, dragging across the porch with an unnatural cadence. Then, just as suddenly as they began, they stopped. I stood there, staring at the door, my grip on the poker tightening as the fire crackled behind me. The radio remained silent, as if waiting for my next move. The silence stretched on after the knocking stopped. I stayed rooted to my spot by the fireplace, gripping the poker so tightly my knuckles turned white. Outside, the darkness pressed against the windows like a living thing. But inside, it was something else entirely. The firelight flickered and danced on the cabin walls, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement, something darting just beyond the edge of the light. "Stay in the light," the voice on the radio had said. It echoed in my mind as I scanned the room, my eyes adjusting to the dim glow. The radio sat dormant on the table, its metal surface gleaming faintly. I wanted to speak again, to tell me what to do next, but it remained silent as if it too was waiting. A creak came from the loft above. My eyes snapped upward. The wooden staircase groaned under an unseen weight, as though someone or something was descending. I swallowed hard, reminding myself of the rules. Do not investigate noises from the loft. I turned my back to it, focusing on the fire. My hand trembled as I added another log, the flames sparking to life and casting sharper shadows across the room. But those shadows, something was wrong. They weren't moving in time with the firelight. They stretched and twisted unnaturally, like they had a mind of their own. A sudden cold breeze swept through the room, snuffing out the fire. The darkness rushed in, engulfing everything. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for the matches, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The sound of something scraping against the wooden floor filled the cabin, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Finally, I struck a match, the tiny flame casting a weak glow. I lit the fire again, and the room flooded with warmth and light. But when I turned back toward the table, the radio wasn't there. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath. The radio had been right there. I scanned the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadows were still, but they felt heavier, almost tangible, like they were pressing down on me. The scraping sound returned, louder now and closer. I turned toward the noise, my eyes locking onto the staircase. Something was coming down slowly, deliberately. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence. A heavy, oppressive force that made it hard to breathe. I clenched the poker tighter, my instincts screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The door was locked, and the windows were shuttered. I backed away toward the fireplace, keeping my eyes on the staircase. The rules flashed in my mind again. Do not confront what comes from the loft. Then, the radio crackled to life, its voice distorted but urgent. "It's testing you," it said. "Don't give in." The shadow reached the bottom of the stairs, but instead of stepping into the light, it lingered at the edge, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. It didn't have a face, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unyielding. I forced myself to turn away, staring into the fire as the rules dictated. Minutes felt like hours as the presence lingered, watching. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. The room felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifting. I turned back toward the staircase, but it was empty, the shadows retreating to their corners. The radio spoke again, its tone more insistent this time. "You're not alone. Remember the rules. They're the only thing keeping you alive. I sank to the floor, my body trembling as the adrenaline ebbed away. The fire crackled softly, its light the only reassurance in the cabin. But I knew now that I couldn't let my guard down, not for a second. The next morning, or what I assumed was morning, the fire had burned down to embers, leaving the cabin shrouded in a dull gray light. I stretched my stiff limbs, every muscle in my body atching from the tension of the night before. The radio sat back on the table where it belonged, as though it had never moved. It was off now, its dials still and silent. I hesitated before approaching it, half expecting it to spring to life as soon as I got close. But when I picked it up, the cold metal felt solid real. I turned it over in my hands, looking for some sign of what had happened during the night. Nothing seemed out of place, until I saw the small piece of paper tucked under its base. It was the same paper from the night before, with the rules written in neat, blocky handwriting, but something was different. My heart sank as I scanned the list. Rule 1: keep the fire burning at all times. Rule 2: do not look directly into the shadows. Rule 3: avoid the loft at night, no matter what you hear. Rule 4: do not open the door after dark even if someone knocks. Rule 5: do not respond to voices calling your name. Rule 6: the radio's instructions override all other rules. Rule 7: leave no trace of yourself behind. The last rule was new. I stared at it, my mind racing. Leave no trace. What did that even mean? My gaze darted around the cabin, suddenly hyper-aware of every object I'd touched: the chair by the fire, the blanket I'd draped over myself, the dishes I'd used to eat a cold meal. How could I possibly erase all evidence of my presence? The radio crackled to life, breaking my spiraling thoughts. "You're being watched," the voice said, calm but grave. "The cabin doesn't like intruders." I froze, my grip tightening on the piece of paper. "What does that mean?" I whispered, though I knew the radio wouldn't answer. Instead, it continued, as though reading my mind. "Burn everything you've used, every trace, every mark. The cabin must remain as it was." The cabin didn't like intruders. Was that why it had been so cheap to rent? Was it even supposed to be rented at all? The thought of some malevolent force, something beyond my comprehension, watching me from the shadows made my skin crawl. I glanced at the fireplace, now barely glowing with the last remnants of the logs I'd fed it. If I burned everything, would it appease whatever was out there? Or was this some cruel trick? A way to lure me into making myself even more vulnerable? The rules were clear, though, and the voice on the radio had been right so far. I grabbed the chair first, breaking it down into pieces small enough to fit into the fireplace. The fire roared to life as the wood caught, sending sparks dancing into the air. Next went the blanket, its soft fabric curling and blackening in the flames. One by one, I fed my belongings to the fire, my hands trembling as I worked. Each item felt like a piece of myself being erased, leaving me emptier and more uncertain. The air in the cabin grew thick with the smell of smoke and charred wood, but I kept going, until there was nothing left. No sign that I had ever been there. The radio crackled again, its voice softer now. "Good," it said. "You've bought yourself another day. Another day. That's all it was, a temporary reprieve." My chest tightened as the reality of my situation sank in. I wasn't surviving. I was barely treating water, and the tide was rising fast. The cabin was eerily quiet after the radio's last message, the crackling fire the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. I sat in the center of the room, staring at the walls as though I expected them to collapse in on me. Something about the cabin had shifted. It wasn't a physical change. It was more like a heavy, suffocating presence I couldn't see, but could feel pressing against my chest. As the hours passed, I began to notice strange markings on the walls. At first, they were faint, barely noticeable smudges in the wood grain. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a side effect of the sleepless night and the fear gnawing at my sanity. But as the firelight flickered, the smudges seemed to take shape, forming long, jagged lines that twisted and curled like the roots of a tree. I stood and approached the nearest wall, my heart pounding. The markings were clearer now, deep grooves carved into the wood. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the rough texture beneath my fingertips. They weren't random, they were words. "You cannot leave." My breath hitched. I stepped back, my eyes darting around the room. The markings were everywhere now, crawling across the walls like vines. They formed more words, messages written in a jagged, angry script. "Stay silent after midnight. Do not trust the light. The forest is not empty." A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I tried to make sense of it all. Who or what had written these? Had they always been there, hidden in plain sight until now? Or was the cabin itself trying to communicate with me? The radio crackled to life again, its static cutting through the silence like a knife. I jumped, nearly knocking over the chair I'd been sitting on earlier. "Do not touch the walls," the voice said, sharp and commanding. "They are not for you." My stomach churned. I'd already touched them. Panic surged through me as I wiped my hands on my jeans, desperate to rid myself of whatever connection I might have just made. "What happens if I did?" I whispered, though I knew the radio wouldn't answer. The fire dimmed suddenly, the once bright flame shrinking into a weak, sputtering glow. Shadows began to creep across the room, long and distorted. I backed away from the walls, my heart racing as the shadows grew darker, denser, until they seemed almost solid. And then I heard it, a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across wood. It was coming from the walls. I froze, my eyes darting to the source of the noise. The markings on the walls were shifting, moving as though they were alive. The words twisted and rearranged themselves, forming a new message right before my eyes. "You are being watched." The scratching grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't just coming from the walls now, it was all around me, inside the cabin. I grabbed the radio, clutching it to my chest like a lifeline. What do I do? I shouted, my voice cracking. The radio hissed, the static growing louder, and then, through the noise, the voice spoke again. "Stay inside. Do not respond." "Respond to what?" I whispered. But before I could get an answer, the radio went silent. The scratching stopped, the cabin fell deathly quiet, and then, from outside the door, I heard it knock. 3 sharp raps, like knuckles on wood. I froze at the sound of the knock, my breath catching in my throat. It was an impossibility, something so absurd in its simplicity that my mind refused to process it. Who or what could possibly be outside this cabin in the middle of nowhere? And why knock, as though politely asking to come in? The fire continued to sputter weakly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows that stretched across the walls. I tightened my grip on the radio, its cold metal casing grounding me as my thoughts raced. The voice on the radio had told me not to respond, but every fiber of my being screamed at me to do the opposite. Ignoring it felt like tempting fate, but acknowledging it, whatever it was, felt worse. Another knock, louder this time. 3 sharp raps, deliberate and insistent. I swallowed hard, my legs trembling as I stood slowly. I approached the door, each step feeling like I was walking toward a guillotine. My hand hovered over the doorknob, shaking. I leaned in, pressing my ear against the wood to listen. Nothing, just silence. I almost convinced myself to walk away when the knock came again, so forceful this time that the door rattled on its hinges. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. My gaze darted to the windows, but they were completely black, the night outside an endless void. It didn't feel like anything was out there. It felt like everything was. The radio crackled to life, startling me. I clutched it tightly as the voice returned, colder than before. "Do not open the door." I nodded instinctively, even though the voice couldn't see me. My mind raced for an explanation, a way to rationalize what was happening. "Who's out there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Do not open the door," the voice repeated, more forceful this time. "It is not who you think, not who I think." Did that mean it was someone or something I knew? My hands balled into fists, nails digging into my palms as I tried to steady myself. The knock came again, relentless and unyielding, and then a voice, low and gravelly. It came from the other side of the door. "Daniel, open up, it's me." I froze. It was my voice. The sheer wrongness of it hit me like a physical blow. My legs buckled, and I collapsed into the nearest chair, my head spinning. The fire flickered and dimmed further, as though reacting to my fear. "Daniel," the voice called again, insistent. "You can't stay in there forever. Open the door." I shook my head violently, clutching the radio like a lifeline. "What's happening?" I hissed into it, desperation leaking into my voice. "What is this?" The radio hissed with static for a moment before the voice replied. "It's testing you." Testing me? What did that even mean? I glanced at the door, sweat dripping down my face. The voice outside grew angrier, more demanding. "Open the door, Daniel, let me in." My body screamed at me to run, to get as far away from the door as possible, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The knocking stopped, replaced by a deafening silence, and then the doorknob began to turn. The doorknob turned slowly, each metallic creak cutting through the suffocating silence like a knife. I bolted upright, my chest heaving as though my lungs were trying to escape. My hand clutched the radio so tightly it felt like it was fusing to my palm. This was it. The moment that would either validate the rules or unravel me completely. The door didn't open all the way. Instead, it stopped ajar by mere inches, revealing a thin strip of darkness beyond. There was no figure, no silhouette of anything or anyone, just blackness that seemed impossibly deep, as if it would swallow me whole if I stared too long. "Daniel," the voice called again, but this time it wasn't on the other side of the door. It came from the radio, only it wasn't the same voice as before. This one was distorted, warped into a sickly mimicry of my own. "You're not doing well, are you?" The fire sputtered again, shrinking down to nothing more than embers, leaving the room in shadow. I stumbled back instinctively, putting distance between myself and the door. My voice cracked as I shouted at the radio. "What do you want from me?" A chuckle crackled through the speaker. "Want? No, Daniel. It's about what you want, isn't it? Isn't that why you're here? To fix what's broken." My breath hitched. It felt like the air had been sucked from the room. The voice knew. It knew about the memories that haunted me, memories of battlefields and the lives I couldn't save. My fingers trembled as I clutched the radio tighter. The door creaked open further, just enough for something to slip through a shadow. It didn't walk or crawl. It glided, fluid and unnatural, its form shifting as though it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. It stopped just beyond the doorway, and though it had no discernible eyes, I felt its gaze boring into me. The voice on the radio was gentle now, almost kind. "There's a way out of this, Daniel, a way to escape." The shadow moved closer, its edges bleeding into the floor like ink spreading across paper. I wanted to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot, heavy as lead. "How?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The radio crackled. "Let it in." I recoiled instinctively, shaking my head. "No, no way." The shadow extended, something, a limb or maybe just a fragment of itself. It brushed against the edge of the table, leaving a black smear that shimmered unnaturally. The voice continued, coaxing. "You're tired, Daniel. Tired of running, tired of remembering. Let it in, and it will all go away." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes as the weight of its words pressed down on me. I thought of the people I'd lost, the ghosts of my past that followed me into every waking moment. But then I thought of the rules, the ones scrawled on the cabin walls and whispered through the radio. I clenched my fists, the sharp pain grounding me. "No," I said firmly, my voice steady for the first time that night. "I'm not letting it in." The shadow froze, its form rippling as though my refusal had struck a nerve. The radio hissed with static before the voice returned, darker and more menacing. "You've made a mistake." The shadow surged forward, and the fire extinguished completely, plunging the room into total darkness. The darkness was suffocating, pressing against me like a living thing. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face, but I could hear the faint hum of the radio, still clenched in my trembling grip. The shadow had consumed the fire, the room, and perhaps even my hope. My chest tightened as the voice returned, calm yet laced with malice. "Daniel," it purred, "you've chosen defiance, but defiance comes with a price." The cabin creaked under an invisible weight. The wooden beams above groaned as though they were ready to collapse. The air grew colder, and with it came whispers, not the sharp commands of the radio, but a chorus of voices, faint and mournful. Each one sounded like a fragment of a life lost, a decision regretted. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on the edge of the cot, sending me sprawling to the floor. The radio clattered out of my hand, its static growing louder, more piercing. It wasn't just noise anymore. There was a pattern to it, a rhythm that matched the erratic beating of my heart. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into a singular voice. "You can still fix this, Daniel. Open the door." I turned toward the door, now fully closed. It was different now. The wood was dark, warped, as if it had aged 100 years in mere moments. The handle glimmered faintly in the gloom, beckoning me. The rules flashed through my mind again. Wanted, do not open the door for anyone, no matter how they beg or threaten. I shook my head, whispering to myself, "It's a trick. It has to be a trick." But then came the knock. It was faint at first, barely audible over the static. Then it grew louder, more insistent. A second knock followed by a third. Each one felt like it was hammering against my skull. "Daniel." The voice outside was desperate now, and it wasn't the shadow's distorted tone. It was a woman's voice. "Please? I'm lost out here. It's freezing. I need help." I froze. It sounded human. Too human to be a trick. But then I remembered the second rule. If someone outside calls for help, ignore them. They are not who they claim to be. The knocks turned into pounding, and the woman's voice cracked with desperation. "Please, I don't want to die out here." I pressed my hands against my ears, rocking back and forth. "It's not real. It's not real," I muttered. The door shook violently, as though whatever was outside was trying to break through. Then the voice changed. It wasn't a woman anymore. It was my own voice, distorted and mocking. "Daniel, you're a coward. You're letting them suffer because of your fear." The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, forming grotesque shapes that seemed to mock me. The pounding stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so heavy it made my ears ring. "Open the door," the radio hissed. I crawled toward the corner, clutching my knees. The rules were my only lifeline. "No," I whispered. "I won't break them." The door creaked open, a sliver on its own. A beam of pale, unnatural light spilled into the room. I squeezed my eyes shut, but I could feel the light crawling over my skin, cold and invasive. "Daniel." The voice was behind me now, soft and cold. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Then came the final test. When I opened my eyes again, the cabin was eerily silent. The fire was back in the hearth, crackling softly, but gave off no warmth. The door was closed, as if it had never opened. Everything looked ordinary, too ordinary. My body ached as though I'd run a marathon, but I was alive. Or so I thought. I scrambled to my feet, the weight of the night pressing on me. The radio sat in the center of the room, undamaged, and its once frenzied static had softened to a faint hum. The cabin itself looked brighter now, with the first hints of dawn peeking through the warped wooden slats. Relief washed over me. I had survived. I had followed the rules, but the relief was short-lived. I stepped toward the door, intent on leaving, but something caught my eye. On the cabin wall opposite the hearth was a mirror I hadn't noticed before. Its surface was grimy, the kind of thing that had been there for decades without care. I hesitated before approaching, my breath fogging the air in front of me. When I finally stood in front of it, my stomach dropped. The reflection wasn't mine. The man in the mirror looked like me, same build, same face, but his eyes were hollow, his skin ashen. He was mouthing something, but no sound came through. I leaned closer, my hand trembling as I reached for the glass. "Help me," the reflection whispered. I stumbled backward, heart racing. The reflection wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't my imagination. It was real, and it wasn't just a reflection. It was me, another me. The static from the radio surged again, louder and sharper. "Daniel," the voice crackled. No, you know. What do you want from me? I screamed, spinning around the room. I followed your rules. I did everything you said. The shadows along the walls began to coalesce, forming shapes that looked like people, men and women of all ages. Their faces were gaunt and sorrowful, their bodies half consumed by the darkness. They were the previous victims, trapped here by the same rules, the same choices. You didn't survive. The voice from the radio said, its tone dripping with malice. You've only begun. The door swung open, and instead of the forest outside, there was only an endless void of darkness. The shadowy figures stepped forward, their skeletal hands reaching for me. Wait! I shouted. You can't do this! I followed the rules, but the figures didn't stop. The room grew colder, the fire extinguished in a puff of smoke, and the light from the open door seemed to pull at me like a vacuum. The voice in the radio spoke one last time, a cruel laugh underlying its words. The rules are not meant to save you. They are meant to prepare you for eternity. I felt the darkness consume me, pulling me into the void. My screams echoed into the emptiness, lost among the cries of countless others. Weeks later, a group of hikers discovered the cabin deep in the Great Smoky Mountains. Inside, they found an old radio playing faint static and a handwritten list of rules. One of the hikers, a young woman, picked up the note, her curiosity piqued. The radio crackled to life. Hello, it said. If you're hearing this, listen carefully. You must follow these rules. And so, the cycle began again.